They condemned her to the stone pits for a death that was never her doing. Then they handed her over to a broken king instead. 18 winters of muttered nothing. A pack of wolves who called their own alpha ruined. A holy man at a white pulpit swearing the moon herself had cursed him. One human healer. One marriage neither of them chose. One candle burning low enough to finally expose a lie that had lived 18 years. She found something buried in his ear, jointed, breathing, lines of silver edged down its back like a signature. He had not spoken since he was a young man. The very first words out of his mouth were meant for her. Asterisk, I can feel your pulse. Asterisk, temples set ablaze. Wolves howling across ridgelines. A grave that belonged to a dead Luna. A journal tied shut with a green cord. A priest bound at the wrists in silver chain. A king climbing back out of exile with a voice the world had buried alongside him. He leaned his forehead against hers beside a dying fire and said, "When he finally comes for us, I'll be the one to open the door." The lamps guttered inside the walls of Ravenspire, and Alara Vane drew her silver tweezers free from the Alpha King's ear. The metal slick with something dark. Whatever clung to the tip of them twitched. Segmented legs. A shell that drank the candlelight like polished stone. 18 years. That was how long this creature had made its home inside Kale Draven's skull. 18 years of a man saying nothing. 18 years of an entire kingdom calling him ruined behind closed doors. And now the thing was drowning slowly in a jar of silvered wine beside her elbow. While the man stretched across the table opened his mouth to speak for the first time since he was 19 years old. People like to say evil hides in the smallest corners. Alara had never quite believed it. Not until this night. His throat clicked, cracked, caught. A rasp came first, then a shape, then 3 words that would eventually turn a whole kingdom on its head. I can hear. The sound of his own voice seemed to frighten him more than anything else had that night. His expression cracked open, collapsed, then slowly rebuilt itself. He tried again, gentler this time, as though speaking too loudly might scare the gift back into hiding. I can hear you. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her own throat had sealed shut. And besides, a healer standing over her patient's bed didn't get to speak first. Not when that patient had just rediscovered his own voice after nearly 2 decades of silence. She only pressed a strip of clean linen to the rim of his ear and watched a man crawl back out from behind his own eyes. His hand drifted upward. His fingers found the hollow spot behind his ear where that small, dark thing had lived for so long. He pressed against it once, softly. Then he turned and actually looked at her, properly, for what felt like the first time since a courtroom 3 weeks earlier had forced their 2 lives into a single signature. Your heartbeat. His voice sounded like gravel dragged through smoke. I can hear your heartbeat. She nearly laughed, swallowing it back at the last second, because the truth was almost embarrassingly simple. That's because your hand is around my wrist. He glanced down. Sure enough, his fingers had closed there without either of them noticing. He didn't let go. She didn't ask him to. Something had settled into place between them in that instant. Something that would take the rest of the night to put into words. Whatever had planted that creature in his skull 18 years ago was still out there, still walking free somewhere below this fortress. The beetle in the jar wasn't the ending. It was proof, which meant the real story was only just beginning. And she already knew whose name it would begin with, a name she hadn't dared speak aloud, even to herself. A man in grey robes. A man who stood at a marble pulpit. A man who had spent 18 winters convincing an entire kingdom that a good man deserved his silence. That name was going to feel its own weight before winter ended. She intended to see to it personally. 3 weeks earlier the High Court of the Iron Fang Kingdom smelled of old wolfsbane and older resentments. Alara sat on the petitioner's bench, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She'd learned long before that you never slouched in front of wolves, slouching red as prey, and Alara Vane had made a career out of never being prey. She was a healer, a human healer, in a kingdom ruled by shifters, which in practice meant she was barely regarded as anything at all. And yet, She had brought 57 pups and 31 children safely into the world across 6 years. Every single one still drew breath. Everyone, that is, except Lady Seraphine Blackwood. Elder Ragnar Stormhold gazed down at her from the high seat. 68 winters carved into a face that looked half wolf, half stone. He was fair as the old laws allowed, which wasn't quite the same thing, being just. Mistress Vane, this council has heard the grievance brought by Lord Thorn Blackwood regarding the death of his mate on the 3rd night of the harvest moon. The claim before us is one of negligence. She kept her face carefully blank. She had been present for Seraphine's labor. She had watched a young Luna bleed out on her own bedding while her mate paced the hallway outside, drunk on plum wine and simmering rage. She had done everything her mother had taught her, everything the old midwifery scrolls described, everything the smuggled human medical texts she'd studied by candlelight for a decade had prepared her for. Seraphine had died regardless. The pup had died with her, and a good woman was in the ground who should never have been. Behind her, in the back of the hall, High Priest Malachi Thorn shifted inside his robes, 55 years old, silver threading through his temples, a voice like a river running smooth over stone. She could feel his eyes fixed on the back of her neck. He was the one who had first seeded the rumors. He'd been the one to lean close to Lord Thorn's ear at the funeral and murmur that a human's hands had no business on shifter flesh, that the moon goddess herself had turned away from that birth. He'd said it kindly. He said everything kindly. That was always the trick, however. Elder Ragnar continued. This council is aware of certain irregularities in the case, given the complexity of the matter, and the lack of conclusive proof of wrongdoing. We are prepared to offer an alternative to imprisonment at Silverhold. Her stomach dropped. Silverhold, the mines carved beneath the Black Mountains, where troublesome women were sent to break stone until the stone broke them instead. Humans lasted 11 moons there, on average. She had treated 2 who'd escaped, quietly, at her back door. She knew exactly what came out of that place, and what never did. You have 3 sunrises to enter a bonded marriage. Should you do so, and should the chosen mate accept the burden of guardianship, this council will dismiss the petition and consider the matter closed. Marriage. To whom? She was 28 winters old. A widowed, her human husband had married her for a stretch of orchard land 2 years prior, and had died of lung fever without ever once asking her opinion on anything, let alone a book. In Iron Fang, a widowed human healer ranks somewhere below nothing. She was a rumor wearing a body. The council has already identified a suitable alpha. A ripple moved through the hall like wind combing through wheat. She turned her head and found him, Kale Draven, standing near the rear wall, tall, weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age. Black leather, dark furs, the mark of the northern packs. His hair was cropped close at the sides and longer on top, threaded early with grey, though he couldn't have seen more than 37 winters. Clean jaw, loose hands. His eyes touched hers for a single heartbeat, then slid away. Kale Draven, the Broken King. Everyone in the kingdom knew the name. Alpha of Ravenspire Fortress, silent for 18 years, whose first Luna, Eliana, had died screaming in a birthing bed 3 winters past. The man High Priest Malachi had denounced from his marble pulpit as marked by the goddess herself, whose very presence in the capital had been ruled a desecration of holy ground. And this was the mate the council had chosen for her. She looked from Kale to the elder to the smooth, silver-templed priest lurking at the back of the room, and understood the whole shape of it in one breath. A cursed king who could not speak in his own defense, a human woman who could not speak in hers, a courtroom that could dispose of 2 problems with a single afternoon's paperwork. Had she ever watched a good man take the blame his entire life for something that was never his? Because that was exactly what she was looking at now, which meant whatever she said next wasn't only for herself, it was for him too, whether he knew it yet or not. She met the elder's gaze without flinching. I accept. The bonding happened that same afternoon, in the same hall. No garlands, No pack witnesses, no pretense that this was anything other than ink drying on parchment. Malachi Thorne was pointedly, deliberately absent. Elder Ragnar performed the rite himself, hurrying through the old vows as though even he found the taste of them bitter. Alara recited her half clearly, her voice steady. Kale said nothing at all. He inclined his head at the correct beats. When Ragnar reached the words that bound their scents together beneath the goddess, Kale pressed his wrist to hers. His skin ran hot, his pulse beat slow and even, the rhythm of a man who had trained himself into calm, because the alternative was madness. You may seal the bond. Kale hesitated so long she was certain he'd refuse. Then he bent and brushed his mouth against the corner of her jaw, quick, dry, cold as the air outside. A contract sealed, nothing more. They left through the servants' corridor. Lord Thorne Blackwood was waiting on the wide stone steps outside, 40 winters old, his face blotched from drink, a black boar tattoo working along his throat as he swallowed. He blocked her path. His breath reeked of wine, and something worse. This isn't over, human. You killed my mate. You'll answer for it. Cursed king or not. Kale said nothing. He simply stepped between them. He didn't touch Thorne. He didn't reach for the blade at his hip. He only stood there and let Thorne take in the width of his shoulders. The stillness rolling off him, or breathing up or off a lake dot. Thorne stepped back, muttered something ugly, and stalked away. Alara had never before seen a man silenced by nothing but silence itself. The ride to Ravenspire took 4 hours through pine forest. Snow was already gathering in the branches, though the harvest moon had barely faded. She watched the only kingdom she'd known for 6 years shrink away behind them, watched the world narrow and cool and wilden. She studied him without meaning to. His face looked wind-carved, grief-carved. His hands on the reins bore knuckle scars. The kind a man earned splitting his own firewood for 20 winters because he wasn't trusted to choose his own household. Every 40 seconds or so his jaw would tighten, then release, small, involuntary. Pain, she guessed, somewhere behind that ear. She tested the rumors once, asking how much farther they had to travel. He didn't turn his head, didn't blink. Deaf, just like they say except when the mare stumbled over a hidden route. His hands corrected the reins before the horse had even finished shifting its weight. When a pinnacle dropped onto the canvas behind them, he didn't flinch. When the wheel caught a rut, he'd already braced the load a full breath before the jolt reached her hip. Deaf to sound, not deaf to the world. His body was still listening, simply not through his ears. She tucked that observation away, the way she tucked most things away. It was, her mother used to say, the only reason she was still breathing at 28 in a kingdom that would have preferred otherwise. Halfway up the ridge she caught him glancing sideways at her. A brief, assessing look, not the way a man measured a new wife, the way a wolf measured the strangeness of a woman who didn't seem to fear him. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of plenty, Silverhold, the mines, the priest at his pulpit, the cost of the coming winter, whether her hands would ever stop remembering the shape of Lady Seraphine's dying wrist. She carried a long list of fears. He simply wasn't on it. She would understand months later that this, simply sitting beside him without fear, had been the very first useful thing she'd done for him. A mile out from the fortress, his shoulders eased. Not by much, but enough. A man who'd ridden beside Dread for 18 years had noticed, in the last hour of a long day, that for once it hadn't come with him. Ravenspire rose out of the dusk larger than she'd expected. Stone and dark timber, glazed windows that spoke of either coin or craft or both. A courtyard, a stable, a training ring worn smooth by decades of quiet use. The stillness here was the deepest she'd ever stood inside. No neighboring smoke, no neighboring road, only the fortress, the pines, and the last light bleeding out along the ridge. Kale helped her down, his grip rough, impersonal, and led her in without ceremony. The great room was spare, almost monastic, a laid hearth, a long table with 2 chairs, a wash basin, to closed doors on opposite walls. On a shelf above the fireplace stood 3 books she recognized by their spines even at a distance, a human anatomy text, a treatise on herbal fevers, a slim volume on diseases of the wolf's throat, a cursed alpha king who kept medical texts, who had bonded himself to a stranger just to save her from the mines. She didn't understand him yet. She would. Kale pulled a slate from his coat and chalked out 3 careful words. Asterisk, you take West Room. I sleep by fire. Asterisk, she read it twice. She'd braced herself for a great many things tonight. Not this. That isn't necessary, she said before she could stop herself. He watched her mouth. He couldn't hear her, but he could read her well enough. He shook his head and wrote again. Asterisk, already decided. Asterisk, something in her chest that had been braced for worse finally loosened. She'd prepared herself to endure a stranger's hands. She hadn't prepared for a stranger's decency. All right, thank you. He nodded and turned to build up the fire. She carried her small trunk into the West Room. Narrow bed, patchwork quilt, a cracked shard of mirror, one window facing the pines, and on the bedside table a 4th book, older than the rest, its cover cracked, its title half worn away. Asterisk, advanced study of the deaf ear and diseases of the skull. Asterisk, she sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were steady. Her stomach was not. A cursed king who owned a book on skull disease. A man the whole kingdom called ruined, who was, she suspected, sitting at his own hearth right now in more pain than he'd ever admitted to a single living soul. She hadn't felt useful since Serafini died. She hadn't felt useless in the last hour, either. And that, she realized with a small jolt, was the first real change of the night. She lay awake 4 hours, the 4th book open across her chest, listening through the deep hush of the mountain fortress to a stranger moving carefully around his own hearth, so as not to wake her. She heard him build the fire, rinse a cup, drop a piece of kindling and hold still for 3 full heartbeats before setting it right, as though startled by his own dropped wood. Strange, for a deaf man. A deaf man couldn't be startled by sound, unless he'd felt the vibration, unless he'd trained himself to feel every tremor in the floor, because vibration was the only listening left to a man locked inside silence. She filed it away to Dot. She was still turning it over when the crash came from the great room, heavy, wet, a body meeting stone. Dot. She was moving before her thoughts caught up, robe around her shoulders, bare feet on cold flagstone, hand already on the door. She didn't know yet, pushing it open, that she was about to change the course of a kingdom. She only knew a good man lay on the other side of that door, and tonight, she was the only healer in the world who had already decided to look. Kale lay curled on the floor beside the hearth, one hand clawed against the right side of his skull, the other locked white-knuckled around the leg of the table, hard enough to creak the wood. Sweat slicked his face. His teeth were bared. Fine tremors shook through him head to foot. Her healer's mind sliced clean through the fear. She dropped to her knees, caught his wrist, pulse fast, thready, wrong. She tilted his face into the lamplight, right pupil blown wide, left one normal. Pressure building inside the skull, sudden, dangerous. Her eyes went to his ear. In the low honeyed light, she saw it, a thin dark trickle along the rim, and within the canal, something with angles no natural thing should carry. She leaned the lamp closer, held her breath. The angles moved, her stomach flipped. She didn't look away. She grabbed for the fallen slate. Her chalk was gone. She snatched a charred stick from the hearth instead and scrawled across the slate in ugly, smoke black letters. Asterisk, something is alive in your ear. Let me take it out. Asterisk. She held it inches from his face. His eyes cracked open, dark, bloodshot, carrying a suffering so old it radiated off him like heat. He read the words twice. He looked at her, truly looked, and she watched the calculation move behind the pain. Every healer who had come before her, everyone who'd lied, shrug, murmured of curses. He was weighing whether he could survive being lied to once more. He nodded. Barely. Once. It was, she'd think later, the single bravest thing she'd ever watched a man do. She moved fast. Fire built high in the kitchen hearth. Water into the copper pot. Her kit from the trunk. Fine silver tweezers, meant for splinters and glass. Curved forceps. She'd bartered a lamb For 2 winters back. Silver, all of it. Silver didn't poison Shifter flesh the way iron did. She sterilized the tools in boiling water, then over open flame until they glowed, then laid them on clean linen to cool. Warm olive oil into a clay bowl, drawn up into a slender dropper, a trick she'd used twice before, on children with beetles trapped in their ears. Insects hated oil. They fled toward light. Kale had dragged himself into the chair, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. When she touched his shoulder, he lifted his face. She pointed to the table, mimed lying with his head turned. He understood, stretching out along the wood on his side, right ear up, cheek pressed flat, eyes shut. She positioned the lamp. She spoke anyway, though she knew he couldn't hear it. The words were only for herself. Asterisk, this will hurt. I'm sorry. I'm here. Asterisk, she dripped the warm oil in. 1 drop, 2, 3. It pooled dark, then darker, as something within it shifted, away from the heat, then toward it. 5 minutes. She counted them in his breathing. His fists were clenched bone white on the table. She didn't tell him to loosen his grip. She understood that grip was the only thing keeping his skull still. Then she saw it, a segmented body, easing toward the mouth of the canal, ink black, glossy with oil and old blood, 6 barbed legs. She lifted the fine tweezers. Her hand didn't shake. The first attempt failed. The creature bolted deeper, faster than she'd expected. Kale made a small strangled sound in his throat, likely the first sound of its kind he'd made in 18 years. She switched to the curved forceps, found what she thought was a joint behind whatever passed for her head, got purchase, held, pulled, slow, even, the same steady draw she'd once used to reset a farrier's dislocated shoulder. No jerking, never jerking. Kale's hands ground against the wood. His whole body shook. His head never moved. The thing came free all at once, 2 inches long, 6 legs clawing at the air as she lifted it into the light, black enough to swallow the flame whole, and along its spine, catching the glow, ran a fine deliberate line of silver, not color, but etching, runes, small, precise, the kind of work only a jeweler or a priest could manage. She dropped it into the jar of silvered wine she'd already prepared. It thrashed, struck the glass twice, went still, legs curled inward, as if it had died clutching something. The room fell into a silence, so complete she could hear the hearth itself breathing. Kale sat up slowly, as though realizing how his own body was meant to hang together. His hand rose, fingers finding the rim of his ear, pressing lightly against the bone behind it. His mouth opened. The rest she already knew. The 3 words, the startled voice, the wrist, the heartbeat. What she hadn't expected came after. His eyes dropped to the jar, tracked the silver line along the creature's spine. Still enough of a healer's son, apparently, to recognize what he was looking at. That was placed there. His voice, when it returned, was very quiet. She nodded. On purpose, she nodded again. He looked at her, not with fear. Something colder. By someone with silver work skill. Yes. With access to temple archives. Yes. By someone who spent 18 years telling this kingdom I was cursed. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He was doing the arithmetic behind his own eyes. She could see the columns lining up. Eliana, Serafini. The mind collapse. The holy man at his bedside on the 3rd morning. The exile. The pulpit dot when he finished. He looked up at her, his voice steady in a way that frightened her more than any tremor could have. I want the name, but I want this done cleanly, or he'll bury us both. Then we start with what we can prove. The woman I couldn't save. Her story and yours are the same story, and her body still remembers it. He held her gaze a long moment. Then he reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Brief, warm, calloused, steady. Not romance. Not yet. Something older than romance. Alliance. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. Dawn came grey through the shutters before she finally slept. She never made it back to the west room. She curled into the great room chair by the fire, a blanket over her knees. Kale sat across from her, back against the stone wall, refusing to lie down. He was listening. She understood. To the fire, The wind, the small far sounds of a fortress that had been sealed away inside his skull for 18 years and had just, terribly, wonderfully, come roaring back to life. She slept in fragments. Each time she surfaced, he was still there, watching the jar, watching the door, watching her. She woke to the smell of real coffee, dark, burnt at the edges, the kind traders hauled up from the southern coast once a season. Kale stood at the stove. He turned as she entered, having heard her footstep, and she caught the small delay before he arranged his face into something casual about it. "Good morning." His voice already sounded stronger, smoother than the night before. He'd clearly been practicing while she slept. "Good morning. Alpha, you saved my life. You don't have to call me Alpha. Not until I've earned another name from you. Kale." He smiled, tentative, a muscle realining its own function, but real. He set a mug in front of her, then eggs, dark bread, a small dish of goat cheese. She watched him move carefully. Every scrape of the pan, every rattle of the lid, every crack of kindling made his shoulders tighten before he forced them back down. "You'll have a headache by noon," she told him. "I already do." "Then eat, then rest, then we begin." Your voice, the runes, the beetle, and the name we haven't said out loud yet. He set his mug down and studied her over the rim. "Alara." He said it as though testing whether her name could carry weight in his own mouth, as though he wanted it too. "Yes, I didn't marry you to gain a healer. I know, I married you because a high priest at a marble pulpit told this kingdom that a human woman had no business touching shift of flesh. He said the same of my first Luna, in different words, same voice." He paused, weighing how much of himself he was willing to offer before breakfast. "I thought, perhaps you'd understand what it is to be seen and yet unseen. Perhaps you wouldn't lie to me about my own pain." "I don't lie about pain, not mine, not anyone's. I know that now." He drank, set the mug down, gave a single nod, the sound of a man settling an old argument with himself. "Then we work." Late that morning, wrapped in her fur cloak, she followed him behind the fortress. Fresh snow lay thin and crisp underfoot. He walked without a word, and she didn't push him. He stopped at a small fenced plot beneath a great blue spruce. Inside stood a single unmarked stone. No carving allowed. She understood. Cursed kings weren't permitted to name their own dead. He said the name aloud instead, so the stone might finally hear it spoken. "Lunar Alara Draven. 20 winters. Beloved." She said nothing, offered no comfort. She'd learned long ago that grief didn't want comfort. It wanted to be witnessed. "She died in childbirth," he said. "Third winter of our bond. The pup was breech, the cord wrapped at its throat. The midwife I'd sent for arrived 2 hours late, caught in a blizzard. By the time she reached us, my Luna had labored 19 hours. She died with her hand in mine. I couldn't hear her ask for water." His voice never broke. It did something worse. It went flat and even. Malachi stood at the marble pulpit at her funeral, told the assembled packs the goddess had punished accursed Alpha by taking his Luna. He called for my exile from the capital. He carried the vote because he needed it carried. Do you understand? I've thought of that funeral every night for 3 years, every rest hour. He wasn't grieving, he was steering, and I never understood why. She thought of the runes etched down the beetle's spine. "Silver work, a priest's hand, a priest's hand," she said quietly. "I think I might understand why." He turned his head, looking at her now instead of the stone. "Say it." He wanted you exiled, because a broken Alpha King tucked away in a distant fortress is easier to manage than a whole one on a throne. He wanted you shattered, because a shattered king is simpler to explain than a murdered one. A dead Alpha needs a successor. A cursed Alpha needs a regent. A regent needs a voice. A voice needs a pulpit. He went very still. His pulpit. Wind moved through the spruce above them. A little snow slid free from a branch with a sound like a turning page. "Alara, yes, you're the first person in a long time to speak to me plainly. I want you to know I heard it." She had no answer for that, so she did what she was best at, reached across the fence and pressed her palm flat against the cold headstone above his dead Luna's grave. She stood there beside him, letting him have the moment without intruding on it, only making certain he wasn't alone inside it. They walked back to the fortress in silence. Inside, the small jar caught mid-daylight through the window, silvered wine, a black cold shell, fine silver script running along its spine, waiting. "We'll need stronger proof than one beetle in a jar," she said. "We'll get it. He'll come for you the moment he learns you can speak plainly. 2. Let him. He'll come for me first." Kale stopped in the center of the room and turned to face her fully. Something new moved across his face. Not tenderness, not gratitude. Something older than either, and far more dangerous. "He'll find that inconvenient," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. 2 days later, Roran Ashful rode up the ridge, 35 winters, broad through the chest, dark hair tied back, an old Ashful packmark curling along his wrist. Kale's captain of arms, and the only wolf in the kingdom who had refused, for 18 straight years, to leave his alpha's side. Ashfuls didn't abandon a bloodline they'd sworn themselves to. Ashfuls died first. Alara had heard the name, never met the man. She stood on the porch, arms crossed over her cloak, and watched him swing down off his horse and take the steps 2 at a time. In the first 5 seconds, she understood exactly why Kale had kept him close all these years. Loyalty rolled off him like weather. He inclined his head, formal, neither warm nor cold. "Mistress Vane, Captain Ashful, may I see my alpha? He's in the Great Hall." "Good." Then he actually looked at her, and something shifted behind his expression. Not suspicion, not welcome. Assessment. Word travels fast from the capital. "Mistress, 2 days ahead of me, if the wind favors it. Whatever you've done up here, you'd better be certain it holds." She held his eyes without blinking. "It will hold." "Then I'd like to see my alpha now." She stepped aside. Kale stood at the hearth when Roran entered. He didn't turn, because he'd already heard the boots on the flagstones, had already heard the horse a full minute before that, because now he could hear. Roran crossed the steps into the room and froze. Alpha, Roran. That single word. Roran Ashful had dragged his alpha out of a mine collapse at 19, carried him home his own back, watched him wake 2 days later, and never speak a full sentence again. Had spent 18 winters running his errands, guarding his gates, translating his slate for strangers, standing between his throat and every blade in the kingdom. And now his alpha stood at a hearth and said his name. Roran didn't drop to his knees. Ashfuls didn't kneel to a living alpha. He did something coursier. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pressed his forehead to Kale's, wolf to wolf, and neither man breathed for a 4 count. "Say it again, Roran. How?" Kale didn't answer. He looked past his captain, toward Alara in the doorway, and tipped his chin. Roran turned, and this time his gaze held something closer to awe. "Laced with iron, mistress, explain." She did, plainly, the way a healer reported at a bedside. Symptoms, findings, method, result. She lifted the jar, so the rooms caught the firelight. Roran studied the creature, glanced at Kale, studied it again, then sat down at the long table without waiting for permission and put his face in his hands. A captain of arms was allowed exactly one such moment, and he took it when he lifted his head again. His eyes were dry and hard. "Alpha, may I speak plainly? You've earned that. I've stood beside you 18 years, carried your slate through 3 winters of blizzard, killed the men for calling you cursed to my face, buried a Luna I was sworn to protect and couldn't save from a fever I couldn't even name." He drew a long breath. "So when I ride back down to the capital and stand before High Priest Malachi Thorn, what do you want me to tell him?" "Nothing. Ride down. Deliver the sealed writ you were sent to deliver. Collect his in return, and ride back out. Say nothing. Show him nothing. Not even that you've noticed the wind has changed." Roran considered this. Then something crossed his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, the shape of Wolf's jaw made just before closing on a stag's throat. And when the time comes, Alpha, you won't have to ask me twice. No, Alpha. He stood, inclined his head to Alara. This time the gesture carried new weight beneath its formality. A wolf recognizing the one who'd fed his pack. Mistress Vane. Thank you. Not a word, she suspected. Roran Ashful handed out often. He turned for the door, then paused, glancing back at Kale, his voice dropping low, almost private, almost human. Aliana would have loved to see this day. Kale's throat worked. She would have. Roran left. The kitchen sat quiet long, as the hoofbeats faded down the ridge. Alara returned the jar to its cupboard shelf, closed the door, and turned to find Kale watching her with something new in his expression. What? You handled him the way you handled me. I don't know what you mean. You do. She did. A healer at a good bedside didn't soothe. She offered the truth in pieces small enough to swallow without choking. She'd done it for Roran. She'd done it for Kale. She'd done it for everyone she'd ever laid hands on. It was the only real trick she owned. Kale crossed the kitchen and stopped a step short of her, not touching. Alara. Yes, when this is finished, when the priest is dealt with, when you're free of the courthouse and I'm free of the pulpit. He seemed to be choosing each word off a high shelf. Careful, almost afraid of a throat that had only just learned how to select its own words. I'd like to ask you something. Only when it's finished. Only when it's finished. Then you have something worth fighting for. Alpha, I had that before you ever said it. She let herself smile. Brief. Quick. A gift withdrawn before it could turn into currency. Go sit. I want to check your ear again. He sat. She checked his ear. She tried very hard not to think about the question. The blow landed 3 mornings later. A young rider came up the ridge beneath a torn banner, barely 20, in the pale grey robe of a silver-hulled acolyte, his horse lathered white at the neck. He wouldn't dismount. He passed a sealed scroll down to Alara with a shaking hand and refused to meet her eyes. Then wheeled his horse and rode back down before she'd even broken the seal, which told her everything she needed to know before she'd read a single word. Kale came out onto the porch behind her and read the scroll over her shoulder, his breath steady against her hair, his jaw anything but. The seal belonged to Malachi Thorn. The words belonged to the temple, short and final, by order of the high priest. In the matter of Lady Seraphine Blackwood's death, the healer Alara Vane was summoned to the marble pulpit at Silverhold, the coming rest day, to offer public confession before the assembled packs. Should she fail to appear, the high priest would petition the elders to annul her bonding on grounds of fraud and remand her to the mines for the rest of her natural life. She read it twice. A third reading would have been a small betrayal of her own nerve, so she stopped there. You won't go, Kale said quietly. I'll go. Alara, if I don't go, he wins twice. He takes the bonding. He takes me. He takes the only reason you had to speak in front of him. If I go, he has to face me in a full hall. Has to keep his mask on in daylight. He won't dare kill me at his own pulpit. His vanity won't allow it. He doesn't need to kill you at the pulpit. He only needs to break you there. He can't break something he's never held. That was the 6th thing she'd said in 3 days she hadn't planned to say out loud. She'd have to break that habit. Given Kale Draven's newfound talent for hearing every one of them, he didn't answer for a long while. Then, very calmly, then I ride with you. You're still under exile writ from the capital. Then I'll break it, Kale. Alara. If a man can't break an unjust writ to stand at his mate's side during her trial, then he never deserved the crown that writ stripped from him. Something in her chest did something she had no name for yet, and wasn't going to find one for any time soon. All right, she said. They spent the following 3 days preparing. Alara combed back through her midwife's notes from Seraphine's delivery, adding observations she'd dismissed at the time, the old bruising, the way Seraphine had whispered, mid-contraction, *, please don't tell my mate. *, Alara had assumed she'd meant the pain. She hadn't thought to ask which pain. She wrote it all down now in her own steady hand. Dates, measurements, the angles of old fractures, the precise defensive pattern of a wrist that had been twisted, not fallen upon. Kale worked on his voice. He read aloud from the anatomy text until his throat gave out, and Alara made him stop. Then he read silently, lips still shaping every syllable, because 18 winters of muscle memory couldn't be unmade any faster than one word at a time. He had no intention of standing in that hall sounding like a stranger inside his own throat. On the last night before the ride, they sat by the fire, she checking her satchel, he inspecting a small dagger he hadn't needed to sharpen in 3 winters. She looked up without meaning to. Kale, yes. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong. If it does, he set the dagger down and looked at her fully. If it does, I'll get you out of that hall alive. Get you on a horse. Get you north to the academy. Master Healer Silon has already agreed. Roran has the route mapped. There's a healing house in the far country that will take you in. No questions asked. A stranger with a new name and a full life still ahead of her. Do you understand? You planned this. I planned it the morning after the beetle. Her throat closed. And you, I stay. I finish it. That isn't a plan. That's a funeral. Then it's my funeral. I've owed 122 women in this fortress for a long time. I'd like to see it done well. She had no answer. She only reached across the small table and set her hand over his, and neither spoke again for a long while. The fire the only sound left in the room. At last she said, very softly, it won't come to that. No, because I don't intend to be carried out. I intend to walk out. His mouth curved, small, real, then walk out we will. Rest day dawned cold and clear. They rode down through the pines together at first light. She wore the same plain wool she'd worn to the courthouse 3 weeks earlier, not for lack of anything else, but because she wanted the hall to see the same woman it had already tried and failed to bury. Kale wore black, the silver work collar of the Draven line stitched into leather at his throat, unworn for 18 years. And it sat there now as though it had simply been waiting, the road to the capital cut through pastures and old milestones, and the banked chimney smoke of pack houses settling in for winter. Every door they passed cracked open to watch them ride by. Word travels faster than horses always do. By the time they crossed the last ridge, and the pale stone of Silverhold rose out of the valley, the road behind them was thick with wolves, not hostile, not yet, curious, which was in some ways worse, because curiosity could be shaped into whatever a skilled speaker wished it to become, and Malachi Thorne had always been a very skilled speaker. They dismounted at the gate. Roran Ashful was already waiting, falling into step behind Kale, as though he'd never left. 2 more Ashful wolves joined him, then 4 more. By the time they crossed the courtyard, Kale Draven led a small silent column of leather and blade, Alara at his elbow, and the crowd at the temple steps parted for them without a word, something that hadn't happened to this king in 18 years. She felt him register it beside her. His stride didn't change, his breathing didn't change, but the corner of his mouth did, just slightly, the shape a man's mouth made, remembering, after a long absence, what it felt like to walk toward a door instead of away from one. Inside. The air hung cold and sweet with beeswax. The vaulted ceiling threw their footsteps back down at them in a hush. Malachi Thorne already stood at the marble pulpit, tall, silver-templed, deep temple grey with a moon-white stole across his shoulders, his face arranged into grief, which she suspected was the second most useful expression in his collection. The most useful one appeared the instant he saw Kale Draven walking behind her. For 1/2 of one heartbeat, Malachi Thorne's face went utterly blank. Not shock, not fear. Blank, the way a card player's face goes blank when the wrong card lands, and he hasn't yet decided what story his hands will tell to cover it. Then grief slid back over his features like a slipper. He knew something had shifted. He didn't yet know how much, or how, but he understood, in that instant, that a broken king had just walked into his own hall, his own defeat, in front of his own congregation, and a broken king wasn't supposed to be capable of that. She filed the blank half-second away and quietly pressed her hand against the parchment tucked inside her cloak, the hall filled. Elder Rognar took the high seat, flanked by 2 other elders, one of them Corvin Marsh, elevated the previous year by Malachi himself, his expression already arranged for a verdict. Malachi lifted both hands. Brothers, sisters of the packs, we gather today in sorrow. We gather to give a grieving mate his answer. We gather to hear the healer, who stood at Lady Seraphine Blackwood's bedside account for what her hands failed to do. His eyes settled on Alara, soft, almost tender. Mistress Vane, rise, confess. Perhaps the goddess will show you mercy. She rose, because he'd asked her to, fully intending to give him only the rising and nothing else. Speak. Child, I will confess to one thing. His smile deepened. He'd sat through 100 confessions like this. He already knew the shape hers would take. All thought he did. I failed Lady Seraphine. The hall drew a single collective breath, but not the way you've taught them to believe. The breath never released. She kept her voice low. She'd learned long ago that a hall of angry wolves fell silent faster for a quiet voice than a loud one. Lady Seraphine Blackwood did not die of a difficult birth. She died of a ruptured liver. That liver had been tearing 4 months. Quiet damage, and none of it caused by the child she carried. That damage was caused by a fist. She turned, slow and deliberate, toward the front bench, toward Lord Thorn Blackwood, already rising, already flushed, already opening his wine-soured mouth to shout her down. Her mate's fist, the hall erupted. Thorn surged forward. To Ashful Wolves slid smoothly between him and the pulpit, and Thorn learned in 3 seconds flat that Ashful Wolves didn't yield ground for grieving mates. Malachi raised his hands, his voice cutting through the noise. Slander, inside these walls. Mistress Vane, you dare. She didn't stop. If she stopped now she'd lose her nerve entirely, and if she lost her nerve she'd lose the whole gamble. She drew out the small stack of parchment she'd prepared over 3 nights beneath Kale's hearth. Her midwife's notes. Every measurement, every bruise, every date, every private word a dying young Luna had confided to her healer in the hours before death. She held them aloft. On the 17th day of the frost moon, Lady Seraphine came to my clinic with 4 cracked ribs on her left side. She told me she'd fallen from a horse. Women of her lineage do not fall from horses. On the 3rd day of the long moon, she returned with a broken left wrist, the kind of break only made by a hand larger than her own, twisting. On the 7th day of the Wolf moon, she asked me whether a Luna could be granted separation from her bonded mate on grounds of cruelty. I told her no. Iron Fang has no such writ. She looked at me and said, "Then I will die in that house." The hall had gone still, not silent, still, which was worse, because still meant every wolf in the room was now listening to her, not to Malachi. She died in that house. She died of a torn liver, ruptured under the pressure of a final contraction, on damage that had been building 4 months from a fist. She did not die by my hands. She died by his. She turned, pointed, not for theatre, simply direct. That man killed his mate. Thorn Blackwood howled. The sound a wolf makes when the rope finally tightens, raw and ugly. The sound of a man recognizing his own guilt in front of his own pack. He lunged. Roran caught him at the elbow, 2 more ashfuls at the shoulders. Dragging him back, Malachi's voice had turned to ice. The honey burned away. Mistress Vane, you accuse a bonded alpha of murder on the word of a healer and a stack of parchment. I do. On what witness? On forensic examination, I am formally petitioning this hall for an independent healer's review of Lady Seraphine's remains. I have already sent word north. Master Healer Silon of the Academy has agreed to conduct it. She arrives within 2 weeks. The colour drained from Malachi Thorn's face. Not much, not for long, but she saw it. So did Elder Rognar. She was fairly certain Roran did too, because Master Healer Silon answered to no temple. She answered to the Academy, to the Elders, and to no one else's convenience. Elder Rognar leaned forward on the high seat, his old voice gravel. Mistress Vane, this petition is granted. Master Healer Silon will conduct her examination on the record. This council will hear her findings. No hand of the temple touches that body between now and then. Malachi turned to him with the smoothest smile of his life. Elder Stormhold. With respect, High Priest. This is not your hall today. The entire temple heard, in full, the exact moment a 68-year-old elder set his foot down in front of a full congregation and declared out loud that the temple did not govern this room. She didn't look at Kale. She didn't have to. She could feel him behind her, standing very tall, very quiet, in a hall from which he'd been formally exiled for 3 years, and not one soul in the room had found the nerve to name the writ meant to keep him out. Malachi found his smile again, inclined his head, offered the room a bow woven entirely from malice under silk. As the elder wishes, Ragnar looked past him, straight at Kale. Alpha King Draven. Welcome home. The hall inhaled hard, like an animal just told the fence had come down. Kale inclined his head 1 precise inch. Elder Stormhold, accursed king answering with a full, steady voice on a marble floor. Every Wolf present understood exactly how impossible that was supposed to be. Malachi's smile never wavered outwardly, but his eyes flicked once, to Alara, to Kale, to the small bundle tucked at her ribs. In half a second he'd done the math. Someone had opened Kale Draven's skull. Someone had looked inside. He didn't yet know what she'd found, but he knew. The way a man who's buried a bomb knows the smell of a lit fuse, that it had just come loose from the wall. He inclined his head to the elder, turned, and left the pulpit with the grace of a man who just decided to burn his own house down before the fire brigade arrived. They walked out of the temple together, Kale's hand steady at the small of her back, not possessive, just present, as though he'd been waiting to offer it since she first rose from the bench and had only now earned the permission. The road home was thick with packs, staring, whispering, but not yet attacking. Word had run 3 separate directions through that hall today, and no Wolf in Ironfang seemed sure yet which version was the one to bet on. That suited Alara fine. She didn't need them on her side. Not yet. She only needed them uncertain. Halfway up the ridge, Kale reined in his horse and stared out over the valley in silence a long moment. The pale stone of Silverhold sitting in it like a bone lodged in a wound. Alara, yes. Do you know what you gave me today? Tell me. The first sentence of my life, spoken out loud in that hall, that no one in it could pretend not to hear. Her throat closed. She reached across the space between their horses and set her fingers briefly against his sleeve. There will be more sentences, yes, and he'll come for us before Silwan ever rides in. Let him come. He looked at her, the wind pulling at his hair, his hand steady on the reins, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man who owned the ground beneath his own boots. You look like an Alpha King today. Kale Draven, she said quietly, his mouth curved, small and real. I've had a good teacher. They rode on. They'd barely reached Ravenspire when the next blow landed. An old woman waited on the fortress steps. 60 winters. Hair pulled tight and grey, eyes red-rimmed. She rose as they approached and neither curtsied nor bowed nor lowered her gaze. Because she'd come to burn her own house down before anyone else could do it for her. Kale dismounted first, offering her his hand up the porch step. She took it, studying him the way old women study kings, once they've stopped worrying about what honesty might cost them. Alpha King. Lady Morwenna Blackwood. The name landed hard in Alara's stomach. Thorn's mother, Seraphine's mother-in-law, which meant this woman had raised the man who'd killed her own daughter-in-law. Morwenna's mouth trembled once, then steadied. May I come inside? They brought her into the great hall. Alara pressed a mug of hot cider into her hands, which she held without drinking, simply to keep them from shaking loose of her wrists. Then she reached into her cloak and produced a small calfskin book, wrapped in linen and tied with a strip of green ribbon. Alara recognized instantly the very ribbon Seraphine had worn at her throat. My daughter kept a journal, Morwenna said, hidden inside a hollow book in my library. Before the end, she made me promise, if anything happened to her, I was to take the little green book before Thorn ever found it. Keep it. Never open it, unless the silence became unbearable. She looked at Alara, not Kale. I cannot bear it any longer. Alara didn't touch the book yet. Have you read it, my lady? All of it? Then tell me first, in your own words, what's inside. A healer took the witness's account before the witness could be shaped by anyone's questions. It was the only way to get the truth clean. Morwenna swallowed twice, staring into her mug. My daughter-in-law was not faithful to my son. Go on. She was miserable in that house, frightened, hurt, and young. A man in grey robes offered her comfort. She believed it was spiritual, at first. Then she believed it was more. He has always been a very persuasive man. Alara didn't need to ask which man. Malachi Thorn. Kale's hand closed very quietly around the edge of the table. Morwenna's mouth twisted. But she pressed on. She fell pregnant. She didn't know whose child it was. She was terrified. She went to him, to Malachi, for help. She wrote that he gave her herbs to end it. A scandal in the temple would have ruined him. A bastard in her belly would have gotten her killed by Thorn's own hand. Her voice cracked and reset like poorly healed bone. He told her the herbs were safe. Something in Alara's chest went cold and very still. What herbs? Pennyroyal, black cohosh, tansy. She names them all in that book. The doses, the timing. Alara closed her eyes for one full breath. Pennyroyal, black cohosh, and tansy. At doses a frightened Luna in her 3rd trimester would take if a priest promised her they were safe. Would never end a late pregnancy. They would tear a liver instead, a liver already softened by months of a fist. They would turn a difficult labor into a fatal hemorrhage. They would kill a young Luna in front of her human healer, who would then spend 3 weeks hearing from a marble pulpit that the death was her own fault. She opened her eyes and looked to Kale. His expression had gone eerily calm. His hand on the table's edge had gone white to the knuckle. Lady Morwenna, he said, his voice quiet enough to almost pass for gentle. Do you know what happened to my Luna, Eliana? Morwenna didn't answer at first. She stared at the mug, then the book, then finally lifted her eyes to his. I've wondered, she said. 3 years ago, when she fell ill in her final month, when the midwife couldn't reach the fortress for the storm, when the fever came, her voice thinned. Malachi Thorn climbed this mountain, Alpha King, uninvited. He said he came to pray. My son escorted him himself. I remember thinking, what a strange courtesy. A high priest visiting a cursed king in exile. Kale didn't blink. He entered her sick room. He did. He placed his hand on her forehead. He did. And she was worse by morning. She was. The room fell so silent Alara could hear the flue pulling at the fire. She was the one who finally spoke, because if Kale said it alone, he would break in a way she couldn't mend. He's taken 2 Lunas from you, Kale, the mate of another alpha, and he kept a moon-cursed thing lodged inside your skull for 18 years, to guarantee you could never sit a throne well enough to answer him. He didn't just build a lie about you. He built an entire career on you, a temple on you, everything he is. He is because you were silent. Kale said nothing. He looked at the little green journal, at the jar on the shelf where the beetle still floated, at the fire, at last, at her. Alara, yes, when he comes for us, and he will. I would like to be the one who opens the door. You will be. Kale, who had not been permitted to answer a high priest inside this hall since he was 19 years old, opened his mouth. Malachi, the hall caught its breath again. I have listened to your voice a very long time, Kale said, his throat still rough, the words heavier for it. I heard it inside my own skull when I could hear nothing else, because yours was the last voice I heard clearly, on the 3rd morning after the mine collapse, when you laid your hand on my head and told me I was cursed. That voice has lived in me since I was 19. I know it well. I know its warm places. I know exactly where it lies. Malachi's face didn't move. So when you say you've loved me, High Priest, I want you to know I heard that too. And I've decided it isn't true. The hall held its breath. Malachi's smile stayed fixed, but something behind his eyes shifted. For the 2nd time that day, Alara caught the card player's blank half-second cross his face. He lifted his bound hands and pressed them deliberately over his heart. and began to hum, soft, almost sweet. A three-note figure that dropped and rose, and dropped again. Old Mother Bryn's head snapped up beside Alara, like a hound scenting smoke. "I hear it," Alara whispered. "That's a moon-binding cadence. Girl, he's opening a passage." In the middle of the hall, the stone beneath the witness stand warmed suddenly. The air above Malachi's shoulders bent, the way heat bends over a road in summer, and a faint circle of pale silver light began to trace itself into the flagstones around his feet. His humming deepened. He meant to leave the room, not through the doors, but through the floor, which meant he'd built this escape before of a standing trial, which meant he'd known from the moment, still untouched the first bone, that a verdict was coming, and had prepared forbidden's mooncraft inside a full temple, to save his own skin, a confession in itself. If anyone in the hall lived to say so, Alara moved. She'd been the one who studied the Beatles' runes. She'd spent 3 nights reading through Alina's old herbal, which she'd brought along in her cloak that morning without quite knowing why, except that she'd learned this past month to trust the itch at the back of her own neck. She pulled out a small pouch of coarse silver salt and a stoppered vial of pale wormwood oil. Silver salt to break a moon binding, wormwood oil to unmake a rune. Every academy healer knew the trick. No high priest expected a human midwife to. She flung the salt in a wide arc across his feet, followed by the oil. The circle in the flagstones flickered. His humming caught in his throat like a snagged hook. The circle didn't fully close, only stuttered. She'd bought him a breath, maybe 2. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in calculation, and he began the cadence again. Kale stood. He didn't shout. An alpha king, who'd only just reclaimed his voice 3 weeks earlier, didn't need to. He'd spent 18 years learning how far a small sound could carry, and 3 weeks relearning how to aim on. And he carried something in his throat now that Malachi Thorne had spent 18 years ensuring never happened inside this hall. Alpha command. It came. Low, even, aimed. Kneel. The word didn't land in the ear. It landed in the spine. Every wolf in the hall felt it pass through them. Not compulsion. Recognition. The old bone-deep knowledge every shifter carried since birth of the one voice permitted to command them. It rolled across the marble like a bell struck underwater, and every wolf who wasn't Malachi Thorne braced their knees against it out of pure instinct, because it hadn't been aimed at them. It had been aimed at one man alone. Malachi's legs folded, not gracefully, not by his own choosing. His knees struck stone with a sound the whole hall heard. The humming choked off. The pale circle flared once and died. The temple's silence rushed back in, for one held heartbeat. No one moved, because every wolf in the room was doing the same arithmetic. A cursed king couldn't carry Alpha Command. Alpha Command required a whole throat. A whole throat required a whole wolf. A whole wolf required a soul the temple had spent 18 years insisting was broken beyond repair. The temple had lied. Every wolf in that hall reached the same conclusion in the same breath, and Alara felt it move through the room. Jingweather. She'd watched crowds turn before. She had never watched one turn on a single syllable. Kale didn't sit. Roran. Take him. Roran was already moving, crossing the hall in 5 strides. 2 more ashfuls at his back. They lifted Malachi Thorne under both arms, his mouth still open. No sound coming out, not from the command, but from the simple fact that a hall full of wolves was watching him fail to escape his own trap. And a high priest with a bound throat inside a full temple had only one currency left, and not nearly enough of it to buy back the rest of his career. Elder Rognar rose, his voice needing no volume at all. By the authority of this council, and the ancient right of the Pax of Iron Fang, on the count of murder, by chemical means of Lady Seraphine Blackwood, on the count of murder, by chemical means of Luna Alara Draven, on the count of the practice of forbidden's mooncraft, on the count of assault by mooncraft upon the person of Alpha King Kale Draven, Malachi Thorne, formerly High Priest of Iron Fang, is sentenced to lifelong confinement in the vaults beneath this hall. His name is struck from the temple rolls. His voice is struck from the pulpit. His writings are ordered destroyed. He turned to Lord Thorn, on the count of assault, over the course of a bonded marriage, upon the person of Lady Seraphine Blackwood, and on the count of contributory homicide arising from that assault, Lord Thorn Blackwood is sentenced to 10 winters of hard labour in the Silverhold mines. Thorn didn't fight it. He'd gone grey in the face, looking, more than anything, simply tired. Our AG and Aya turned last to Alara. Mistress Vane, all charges brought against you are dismissed. On the record, this council extends the formal apology of the Pack of Iron Fang to be inscribed in the roll of elders. She'd expected, since the day the summons arrived, that she'd cry when this moment finally came. She didn't. The apology was already too small for everything it had cost her, and there wasn't room left in her for both it and grief at once. She only inclined her head, spoke the correct words, and looked at Kale at the front of the hall, understanding in one thin second that this was the first time in her entire life a room had ever said, out loud, that she'd been right. She was going to need a whole new pasture for the rest of her life. This one hadn't been worn in yet. Outside, the sky over the capital hung pale and clean, the wind carrying the smell of coming snow. Kale walked beside her, the ashful pack at their backs, and not one soul on the temple steps blocked their path. Not one gaze on the courtyard stones dropped away in shame. In the space of a single syllable, the kingdom had remembered its Alpha King. She would think of it, in later years, as the moment Iron Fang finally exhaled. Snow fell in the second week after the trial, soft and slow, muffling the pines. Kale and Alara stood on the Ravenspire porch and watched it fill the courtyard. Him with a mug of dark tea, her still wearing her medical satchel from a difficult labour down in the village. She hadn't yet had a chance to unbuckle. Alara, yes. Do you remember the night by the hearth, after the beetle, when I told you I wanted to ask you something? When it was over. I remember. It's over. She didn't turn to look at him. She'd have wept if she had, and she wasn't ready to cry on the first true morning of her real life. Ask, then, Alara Vane. I didn't marry you for a healer, didn't marry you for a rescue, didn't marry you because a council of old men loved us together in a single afternoon. I married you because a high priest at a marble pulpit told this kingdom a human woman had no right to touch a wolf, and I hated that man before I'd ever hated anyone else in my life, and I'd have married anyone he denounced out of spite alone. That was true 4 moons ago. I know it. I'm not finished. I'm sorry. It isn't true anymore. She didn't turn. Go on. I'd like to know if you'll stay. Not because a council will send you to the mines if you leave. Not because a writ demands it. Not because I still need my ear checked twice a week. Because you want to. Because I want you to. I haven't wanted anything this clearly in a very long time. You, at this hearth, every morning. She didn't answer right away. The answer already lived in her chest. It simply needed time to become a shape her mouth could give it. Kale, yes. I was chosen once before. By a man who married me for a stretch of orchard land, and never once looked at me the way you looked at me over a jar of silvered wine. Somewhere this winter, I decided I would never again be chosen for that kind of reason. I will only stay in a house I choose. This is a house I choose. You are a hearth I choose. If you want a wife, I am your wife. If you want a mate, I am your mate. If you want an alpha's Luna, that's a longer conversation, since I'm not a wolf and don't yet know what a human Luna looks like in this kingdom, but we can find out. He was quiet a long moment. Alara, yes, I'll spend the rest of my life finding out. She turned then, no longer caring whether he saw her cry. He set the mug down on the rail, took her cold hand in his warm one, and instead of kissing her, pressed his forehead to hers, Wolf to healer, the same way Roran had pressed his 2 cows the day the world tilted. It was, she understood, the way his people expressed the largest things they carried. I chose you, he said quietly, into the small space between them. I chose you. The winters that followed built a kingdom, a marriage, and eventually a small dark-haired boy neither of them yet knew how to imagine. Kale rebuilt the temple, not the stone, the office. He unwound Malachi Thorne's old power one thread at a time, appointing a rotating council of priestesses and priests from the northern healing halls. No single voice ever holding the pulpit longer than 12 minutes. No sermon on a Luna's death ever delivered without a healer present. Elder Rognar remarked dryly, one council afternoon, that it was the first law in Iron Fang's history, entirely, to prevent one specific man. Alara opened a healing house in the capital, staffed with 3 of old Mother Bryn's granddaughters and one of Siwan's own academy students. She wrote a paper on recognizing quiet damage in bonded mates and sent it north. The academy printed it, and within a year every midwife in the kingdom carried a copy in her satchel. It began, in her own plain hand, with a line the academy left untouched. Asterisk, if a woman flinches when her mate enters the room, look at her ribs before you look at her belly. Asterisk Kale, at his own quiet insistence, spent the second winter at the academy studying beast healing under Siwan, the oldest student in the room, and the most silent, which the younger students mistook for the old rumors before realizing it was only concentration. He wanted to know how a rune could bind a small living creature to a large one. He wanted to know how many other men in the kingdom might, at that very moment, be carrying something small and dark behind their ears. He and Alara opened a screening clinic together that same year, and between them cleared 11 cases, none as old as his, all bearing the same hand. Malachi Thorne's reach, it turned out, had extended farther than any vault could hold him accountable for. They spent a great deal of the second year traveling to remote pack houses in the far country, opening ears, handing men back their voices. Widows wept when their sons spoke to them for the first time in a decade. Wolves tried to offer Kale their throats in gratitude. He never accepted, always answering with the same steady, patient rasp. I didn't save you, she did. And you never needed to be silent, only listen to. The next man who tells you your pain isn't real is the enemy, not the pain. By the third year, it had become a saying passed hand to hand through the healing halls. They returned from the last of those journeys in the spring of the third year. She was exhausted and, as she'd realized 2 months earlier, and told no one, carrying. She told him at their own hearth, their first night home, afraid in a way that a lifetime of watching Lunas die on tables didn't leave a healer easily neutral about. She'd run every calculation, planned every fallback, written a birth plan, and sealed it beneath the same flagstone that had once hidden her drawings of a beetle's back. She was still afraid. She told him that too. Kale covered her hand with his. Alara, you've opened 2 graves, 11 skulls, and ended a high priest's career in 3 winters. If any woman in Iron Fang survives her own labor, it will be you. We'll call for Siwan, for Bryn, for every good midwife in the kingdom. Roran will stand at the gate. Half the Ashful pack will hold the ridge. If your body fails you, I'll never lay that at your feet. Only bring me the child if you can. If you cannot bring me the child, bring me you. She wept at that. Having held it in for 100 miles. Labor came the last week of winter. Old Mother Bryn attended. Siwan attended. Kale sat outside the door, back against the wood, the way a good mate did in this kingdom. Roran beside him for 11 hours straight. Neither man speaking. She labored 20 hours. She nearly gave herself to fear at hour 16. She didn't. A stubborn woman who'd once faced down a high priest could still find her own voice 16 hours into labor, and reminded herself she had far too much work left to do to die that day. The pup, when he finally came, was a small dark-haired boy with his father's steady mouth and his mother's careful eyes. He roared with his first breath, loud enough that the Ashful wolves out on the ridge heard him and answered with a single old, high howl, the sound that told a kingdom a bloodline had held. They named him Kale Draven, not Draven Vane, though Kale had offered. She refused. In this kingdom, a pup carried the Alpha's name, a shield. She'd spent enough of her life being clever about shields to know exactly when to accept one. When Siwan finally left the room, and it stood empty of everyone but the 2 of them, Kale sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his son, Then his wife, Alara, you gave me my voice back 3 winters ago. You gave me my kingdom back the winter after that. And this morning, you gave me my son. She was too tired to cry properly. She managed a small sound instead, half laugh, half breath, entirely a smile. You're welcome, Alpha King. He bent his forehead to hers. I chose you. I chose you. The pup slept between them. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and a single lamp burned in a window at Ravenspire Fortress. Any traveller on the ridge road that night, glancing up through the trees, might have seen it and assumed only that some quiet family lived up there, never once guessing the weight that lamp had caused, which was, perhaps, the finest thing about it. There's a lesson tucked beneath this story, and I want to lay it out plainly before we close the fire down for the night. Kale Draven spent 18 winters believing a lie about himself, his elders, his kingdom, his high priest, and eventually his own inner voice all told him the same lie, that his silence was punishment, that his losses were his fault, that his affliction proved he was unworthy. Do you know the deepest cruelty in that? It wasn't the words spoken from the pulpit, it was that Kale, alone at Ravenspire on long winter nights, had learned to repeat those words back to himself in the dark. That is what a long lie does to a good man. It teaches him to become his own prosecutor. I want you to think, for a moment, about the quiet men in your own life, the good ones, the ones who've gone very still around a certain subject, the friend who never mentions his first marriage, the brother who won't speak of the year his son stopped calling, the father who never explains why he left that job, the neighbor who just nods when you ask if he's doing all right. Some of them are carrying something small and dark, planted there a long time ago by a voice they once trusted, and no one has ever thought to check. That's the first thing this story asks of you, to look, not to fix, not to lecture, to look. Sit down with the quiet man in your life and ask him one honest question. Then stay quiet long enough to actually hear the answer. You don't need to be a master healer to manage that. Alara Vane certainly wasn't. She was a country midwife with borrowed books and steady hands. What she had that no one else in that kingdom possessed was the decision to look again, after an entire room had already told her not to bother. That decision costs nothing but your nerve. It's available to you today, and it can save a life. Here is the second thing. Justice arrives late. It came 18 winters late for Kale Draven, weeks too late for Lady Seraphine, 3 winters too late for Eliana. It will arrive late for you too. In whatever way lateness comes for all of us, that isn't a reason to stop reaching for it. That's exactly the reason to keep reaching. Late justice is still justice. A voice reclaimed at 37 is still a voice. A truth finally spoken in a full hall, after a decade of whispers, is still the truth. Don't let anyone, including the voice in your own head, convince you too much time has passed to say what's true. Elder Ragnar Stormhold was 68 winters old when he leaned forward on that high seat and said, "This is not your hall today." It was the bravest sentence of his life, and he waited most of that life to say it. If there's a truth you've been waiting on permission to speak, consider this yours. One last thing before the fire burns down completely. There's a small memorial in the far reaches of Iron Fang, beside the village healing house Alara Vane opened in the 6th year of Kale's reign. Just a single stone, no larger than a hearthstone, carved by the villagers themselves one summer without asking anyone's leave. It reads only, "Tell me where it hurts. That's the whole story. That's the entire trick. 4 words. That's what a country healer said to a broken king in the middle of the night, when no one else in the world had bothered to ask. That's what a wounded kingdom needed to hear for 18 winters and never did. That's what the good men in your own life are waiting to hear, right now, this ordinary week, from whoever loves them enough to ask. So before you go, who in your life has gone quiet on a subject they used to speak about freely? Who's the man in your family, your street, your church pew, who's gone very still around a certain year of his life? What would it cost you to sit with him this week and ask one honest question? Then stay quiet long enough to hear the answer. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the man who stopped talking about a certain time. Tell me about the friend you noticed had gone still. Tell me about the moment you finally looked and what you found. Somewhere out there is a man reading this today who's waiting for his own Alara Vane to sit down across from him and simply say, *tell me where it hurts. *. Your story in the comments might just be the one that reaches him. And if this one, Alara Vane and Kale Draven, the small jar of silvered wine, reminded you of someone you love, stay a while longer. There are more stories at this half, more silences still waiting to be broken, and there's always room for one more good night. Sleep well. Look this week at the quiet man in your life. He's worth the looking.